So oftentimes in Android applications, you're going to want to save certain information in between launches of the application. And this could be things like the user's settings, about how they like to view and interact with the application, or really any type of information that needs to persist once the user closes the application. Well, one of the best mechanisms to do that in Android is the Shared Preferences API. And this is a simple API that basically allows you to save key value pairs of data in between launches of the app. It's very easy to use. So I've created a blank project here called Shared Preferences. And let's go into our main.xml file. And let's get rid of that text view. I'm going to drag in edit text view. So what this application is going to do is we have this edit text view, and we're going to type some text in there and then basically exit out of our application. And then when we come back into our application, it will have remembered the text that was in there. And we're going to save that text in our shared preferences. Every application in Android has a shared preferences storage area that you can utilize. And of course, since the applications run in their own sandbox, these are only available to this application. Okay, so let's go to our Java code. And the first thing I'm going to do is to get a reference to the edit text field. Now, for a reason which I'll describe in a minute, we're going to create a property on the class to hold that reference. So this is going to be private type edit text, and we're going to call it ET. So now let's set that here. ET is equal to find view by ID. And then there's our edit text. And we'll cast that to edit text like that. So now when we come into the onCreate method, again, that means our application has just been created. What we want to do is to read in that value from the preferences. So to do that, we need to create an instance of the shared preferences class. So let's do that. And I'm just going to call this settings is equal to, and now to get the shared preferences, we use the get shared preferences method. And now you can see here we provide a name, which is the name of our preferences file. Now in this case, we don't actually have it yet, but that's fine because it will actually create it if it doesn't exist yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it my prefs in all uppercase. And for a mode, I'm just going to give it a mode of 0, just because basically this is going to allow us to write to the preferences. And again, even if this preference file doesn't exist, which again it won't when we first launch the app, it's going to go ahead and create it for us. So now what I want to do is, since we've come in and we've gotten the shared preferences, is I want to take the text value that's in there and apply it and put it into our edit text. When we first come into the application, when it initially launches, that text won't exist, but there's a nice mechanism where we can put in a default value. So we're going to do ET, and then we're going to say set text to set the text in that edit text field. Now to get a value out of those preferences, I'm going to say settings and then get string, which is going to pull a string out of our shared preferences. Now for a key, I'm going to give it a key here. I'm just going to call it T value for text value. And now we can provide a default value. And what's going to happen is when the user first launches the application, this is not going to exist yet. So we can give it a default for what to put in there on its initial launch. And I'm just going to put an empty string, just so the text field is blank when we first launch this. So again, what's going to happen is when the application first launches, it's going to create this preferences file, and it's going to create this property. And if it doesn't exist, then it's going to put in an empty string. So when we exit the application, that's where we actually want to store what's in the edit text into this property in our settings. So how do we respond to when the application exits? So we do another override here in our activity, and the one we override is on stop. Now this is called when our application is about to exit. So now we can do anything we want in here to basically save state in our application. And in this case, we're going to write something to the shared preferences. So again, down here, I'm going to get a reference to the shared preferences. I'm going to call it the same thing that I did in the onCreate. And we're going to do this same thing, get shared preferences, give it that same name, myPrefs, and again, I'm going to give it a mode of 0, which is going to allow us to write to it. And we have a double quote there. Now, in order to make changes to that setting file, we need to actually get an editor. So we need to get an editor instance. So to do that, we're going to do shared preferences dot editor, and then we're going to call this instance editor is equal to settings dot edit. So calling this edit method is actually going to return to us an editor instance. And this is going to allow us to actually, again, put values and save information into that shared preferences file. Now I can simply just put that string value into the preferences by saying editor dot put string instead of get string. And here again, I'm going to put in the key that I want to use, and I want it to be t value. And now what text do I want to put in there? And this is why I created the property for edit text, because we're going to need to reference it outside of onCreate here in the onStop method. But I'm going to get the text out of there by using the getText method. And like I mentioned before in an earlier movie, this doesn't return a raw string value. It actually returns an editable instance. So I didn't need to make sure I do toString here in order to turn it into a raw string value. So the last thing I have to do is to commit these changes. And to do that, I just say editor.commit. So again, what's going to happen here when the first time the user launches the application, it's going to create this myPreferences file, and it's basically going to determine, hey, this value doesn't exist, so we're going to put an empty string in here. Then when the application closes, it's going to store whatever was in this edit text field into the preferences. So the next time I come in, we're going to get that value back. Okay, so let's launch this, and we'll go over to the emulator. Again, on the initial launch, the default value is an empty string, so we can just see that there's nothing in there. So let's just type something in. This is some text I want to save. So now the way in which we exit applications is to basically hit the back button. So if we hit the home key, we're going to pause the application, but it's not going to be fully exited. So if we want it to be able to really test this, we hit the back key to exit out of the application. So now let's launch the application again. So let me find it here. There's our shared preferences application. And now you can see when it comes in, it saved that text the initial time I launched it. And now when we came back in, it actually read that from the preferences and displayed it here in the edit text field. So you can see, very easy to programmatically set and retrieve values from the shared preferences. In the next movie, we're going to go into what if we want to present a UI to the user to be able to set preferences. And that's what we're going to go over in the next movie.